our final segment, which is between you and lunch, but believe you me, it is going to be an interesting segment. And it's not only because he is my colleague, but it is a conversation that I hope will bring together a lot of what has been shared this morning, especially, and yesterday on ESGs, and have a practical conversation with you about what are the things that ESGs are doing in terms of the values of the items on your financial statements. Mario is a senior manager with us at Ernst Young Barbados and part of the Caribbean practice. He's had over 9 years of experience between professional services firms and as a business development manager with a large regional company. And he's going to share with you his perspectives. So Mario, are you there?
But thank you for having me. Even though it's the unenviable close of just before lunch. And it is quite ironic being in oil and gas before to be doing a presentation on ESG, but that is probably the way forward now. So what we wanted to speak on today was ESG and how does ESG impact your future value. And in terms of the agenda of items that we wanted to touch on, it was looking at the definition of ESG, some of the proponents of ESG, some TCFD recommendations, some of the challenges that you will incur in looking at ESG risks to business models, and finally, how do you harness ESG in value creation? And I think it's probably quite appropriate given the tone of the forum that went before, that this is kind of slotting in now. And being cognizant that we're close to lunch, I will try to make sure we still run to time at 12. So when we kick off into ESG and look at how we define ESG, I think it's important to put ESG into context. Many investors are applying non-financial ESG factors as a part of their analysis to identify material risks and growth opportunities. And these metrics, while not being mandatory to financial reporting currently, there's a general trend towards making these disclosures in annual reports or standalone sustainability reports. And particularly in oil and gas, there's a lot of chatter around sustainability, and you will see quite a few entities are moving towards these sustainability reports. So when we break it down, we look at the environmental, the social, and the governance. Environmental probably is the most topical and generally takes up the most mind space, but social and governance, in our view, are equally as important in terms of setting up your framework and in the assessment of ESG. So when we start to dissect and look at topics such as clean energy, emissions and waste, climate change, which being in the Caribbean region and entering the month of June, this becomes particularly acute. And if we have any people in the insurance sector, many of us will be keeping our fingers crossed for a quiet hurricane season. Health and safety and employee relationships also occupy a specific mind space as well. If you get the best out of your people, generally that translates into getting the best out of your business. And obviously governance generally is becoming more top of mind, particularly if you operate in the financial services sector. There's an increasing requirement for greater governance and transparency in terms of your messaging to investors and other stakeholders. Some of the proponents of ESG generally, you have the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, the Global Reporting Initiative, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which we'll touch on a bit further in the presentation. And generally, we think there's a need to look at it as an ecosystem where the various components of this ecosystem need to operate together in terms of how you develop a robust and valuable ESG framework. So as we look at that ecosystem, is made up of expectations of customers, where investors generally are becoming more skeptical of financial markets and expect greater transparency in their investments and the impact that they have. Sustainability, again, is coming strongly into focus, where there's a general view that long-term sustainable investment is a key focus for asset owners. And there's also an increase in the allocation of capital in support of ESG strategies. Then there's also the macroeconomic and policy framework, where there are bodies such as the Paris Agreement and the TCFD who are strongly advocating for green policies and the need to have strong ESG frameworks to support policy-based lending, and also, setting the investment framework that is friendly towards carbon neutral businesses. Generally, as the demographic shift, you have a change in the perception or the view of the world, where as this generation comes into play, there's a sharper focus on where we're going and what the world looks like by 2050. And you see quite a few pronouncements around, getting carbon neutral by 2030 or getting carbon neutral by 2050. And then the final part of the ecosystem, as we have outlined it, is the regulatory and industry standards, where, again, that need for transparency and a syncing of the regulation to ensure that there's consistency and transparency for investors is also another driving factor behind the push for ESG. So as we move forward, we started to look into the TCFD recommendations, which again are transitory and are continually evolving. But some of the key takeaways that we wanted to look at from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures was the fact that it provided high-level guidance to assessing and disclosing climate-related risks and opportunities, as well as looking at forward-looking data and scenario-based analysis. And with the advent of COVID, I think scenario-based analysis is key to the toolkit of any financial professional or CFO in terms of building out different scenarios for the complexities that we currently face. And the ESG mindset or framework, it probably fits right into that assessment, and really taking a robust look at non-financial indicators and how they're tied back into our financial results. But as we take a step back and look at some of the key takeaways from the recommendations of the TCFD, generally these recommendations were voluntary, and there's probably a scenario in the not too distant future where it may become mandatory for companies to make ESG disclosures. Recommendations were mainly applied to the financial services sector, banks, insurance companies, asset managers, but they also extend to high-risk non-financial sectors such as energy, transportation, materials and buildings, and agriculture. And even if you look at commodity prices right now, where you're seeing the impacts of severe droughts or flooding in various jurisdictions, that has a knock-on effect in terms of pricing and how investors view certain products. And then climate change includes physical risks and transition risks, which we'll speak to in the next slide. And then basically how you create a marriage between quantitative and qualitative. We are on slide 6. So having looked at the recommendations coming out of the TCFD, I think is cognizant to realize that there are some challenges, as with anything that is still relatively in its infancy, in getting data in support of ESG. And I think one of the key challenges, which I believe was touched on earlier in the conference, is the lack of standardization of the data, as well as a CFO, as a person responsible for your financial reporting, what are the data sources that you need to integrate into your ESG report or sustainability report? and where do you find that raw data, and how do you get the big data aggregators that you need to really make sense of the non-financial data. So many of us as accountants will be very comfortable with collating the financial data, but as we move into the gray of the non-financial data, that is where we probably have a bit of work to do in terms of finding out, what are the necessary disclosures and what is the information that's truly valuable to the users of the ESG data. And then obviously you also want to touch on governance, where there's significant risks. And if you look at many surveys around ESG, there is a question around the quality of the ESG data that's being put out, because while a company may embrace ESG and put out these sustainability reports, what does that mean for the investor? How confident can it be in terms of the quality of the data that's being put out? And how do they truly get a transparent view into these non-financial indicators that a company that adopts ESG will put out? But again, we see risk and opportunities to this. So there's cost, definitely as a risk, where in some instances it may result in increased back office support to produce these reports. Again, there may be some level of inconsistency in terms of how you actually collate and produce the data. And then, as I spoke to before, there's that need to have a strong compliance function in place to make sure that you're presenting transparent and usable data. But I think the key takeaway we'll take from this slide is the people who can early adopt and really harness their ESG framework will stand to have a competitive advantage driven into the future. So to the extent that you can get your ESG framework set up and you can build investor confidence, we believe for all the stakeholders involved, that can lead to value creation. So as we continue and look at some of the data challenges and how that's evolved, we think there are some recent developments which I believe may have been touched on before in this session around the consultation between the trustees of the IFRS Foundation in September 2020, where basically I think there's a general recognition that there's a need for harmonization around the policies and bringing a bit more rigor to the quality of data that comes out of ESG. And I think these various bodies working together can build a really robust infrastructure that will allow for improved quality of financial and non-financial data coming out of companies. And for some, depending on which side of the spectrum you sit, there's also the conversation around the need for external regulation to look at, really being able to vet and ensure that the quality of data that is coming out is credible. So what that may mean is increased audit scope, which may make some cringe, but I think the general message here is, is wanting to put forward conceptually ESG is another thing to be able to really harness it and drive it forward in a way that has the same type of rigor that our financial reporting will have. So having kind of gone through the proponents for ESG, understanding the challenges that we may encounter in terms of getting the data in support of our push to ESG, I think it's also important then to put into context the risks that ESG or not adopting ESG puts to business models. I don't want to get into the political argument around whether climate change really is driving some of the natural catastrophes, et cetera, that we're seeing, but the evidence is there, and climate change, we think, represents a significant tangible risk to many business models within the region. And this does range across sectors. And you just have to look at probably 2017 and again, reference to the insurance sector and the impact of hurricanes Irma, Maria to the sector, and the threat that posed to many balance sheets and single period profitability, to really understand, why we need to be modeling in the effect of climate change, running various scenarios and stress tests to really understand what this impact could have in terms of long-term value creation. So we kind of bucket it into two layers of risk: the physical risk, which is the threat to the tangible assets, which then could cascade into your intangible base as well. And then transition risk, which is the lack of preparedness to deal with the physical risk of climate change. So again, making reference to the insurance scenario, how do you frame up that risk? How do you then prepare for the likelihood that you probably have increased exposure to catastrophes? And how do you mitigate against that risk? Because as an insurance company, and I'm just using this example because it's so topical and prevalent right now, if I need to protect against catastrophe risk, does that mean that I have to go and buy more reinsurance? And also knowing that if I do have to access my reinsurance, the next year when I go to negotiate with my reinsurers, the cost of my reinsurance is likely to go up? Or is it a case where there's a role again for government to play in terms of having that policy discussion or public-private partnership that allows for insurers to ensure that there's increased insurance penetration in certain underdeveloped countries, and really having a framework that deals with the impending threat of increased hurricane activity. So that's just a snapshot in terms of some of the risks that we believe not incorporating ESG into your business analysis and forward-looking framework could expose you to. And then as we come across the page, we look at the credit risk, operational risk, business risk, liquidity risk, underwriting risk, because it's not isolated to, say, that insurance context, that has a knock-on effect. So to the extent that, for example, if I were in the oil and gas industry right now, and I were sitting on real estate, for example, and I owned a gas station, again, I will need to be looking into my ESG framework to understand what is that impact of my value of my real estate, as there are so many pronouncements around the move away from fossil fuels. And again, if I'm the banker who has financed that real estate, what does that impact have to my underlying collateral value? So there really is a kind of overarching and far-reaching impact in terms of having a strong ESG assessment process in place in terms of managing and mitigating business risk. And then I think this is probably the most powerful slide in my mind in terms of, yes, it's good to talk about ESG in a contextual fashion, and many detractors from the ESG may ask themselves, well, why would I need to basically incur additional costs or increase regulation in support of these non-financial indicators and ESG? We prefer to flip it around and actually show you how can you actually create value in harnessing ESG. So we believe in many markets, this is the direction they actually are going in terms of investors looking to have confidence in their investments and really roping in ESG into their investment tree. And we believe to the extent that you can appropriately articulate your value story through ESG, it will increase investor confidence and allow access to lower capital, which of course increases the value. Well, we spend a lot of time on the E, the S and the G can help to improve your brand image, which again has value with your customers, it has value with your stakeholders. ESG also, as we alluded to before, helps you in risk mitigation to the extent that you can look forward. And that's why I think ESG is such a good tool, because it really focuses you on looking forward as a business and identifying and putting plans in place to mitigate risk. Government incentives, because I think it's fair to say most governments have a positive posture to green initiatives. And I could point you to one deal that we closed recently where again, we were able to create value because the person was able to install a rooftop solar solution where the economics were actually accretive to value, and we were able to capture that in our valuation and ultimately in the sales price. Improve talent acquisition. As I heard the previous presenters allude to, talent acquisition is key to building any business. While it doesn't show up right now on your balance sheet, human capital is an important tool to leverage to get the most out of your companies. And companies that generally outperform are the ones that can retain their talented employees and keep them motivated and boost employee morale. And then as we pull it all together, all the components of ESG, once you're getting them right, ultimately then should lead to long-term value creation, which again, as investors become more socially conscious and really look towards a longer term mission and vision, long-term value creation comes sharply into context again. And as we seek to wrap it up, I think it's key to then frame an ESG, not just in a first world context, but also how we bring it home to the Caribbean context. We can see climate change and we can see the impact of that on our various territories. And we need to be in a position where we can mitigate against those risks. We've heard all the pronouncements from particularly the Barbados government, which has a very ambitious plan to be 100% renewable energy by 2030. Jamaica is not far behind in their targets as well. And we need to understand what that means for us as businesses and the impact that may have to our balance sheets. Is it a case where, again, as a person managing funds, and when I look at my capital allocation program, is there a role for me to play in driving that renewable agenda forward? And again, what rate of return will I be able to generate as I move from extended carbon footprint to a carbon neutral footprint? And again, how do we as Caribbean companies remain competitive in global markets, which are rapidly shifting their focus and really embracing ESG and how that will play out? And then as a region, how do we remain attractive to foreign direct investors, and what role will their assessment of ESG play in their investment in us? And so when we kind of pull it all together, we think there's significant value to be derived from having a strong corporate image, especially as we alluded to before with the advent of social media, which just allows information to be disseminated at a pace that really needs businesses to be agile and be able to respond quickly to their customers and stakeholder needs. So I think we're buying on 12 o'clock. I will just close by sharing probably the last slide in the deck, which basically puts renewables into perspective. I think this is where there probably is a balancing act that needs to happen for most CFOs and generally stakeholders in terms of the actual cost of moving to a reduced carbon footprint. But I think it's generally recognized that as the technology develops, the cost of our renewable energy generation will generally also start to come down, and the overall impact to long-term sustainability is a sufficient driving force that we will continue on the path to a strong renewable future. So on that note, I will close it and open the floor to any Q&A and hand back over to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mario. And I should let you know that the ICRAC Secretariat and team are extremely grateful to you. The participants would not know that Mario stepped in to assist us to replace the session that was here at the very last moment. And I say last as in yesterday evening. And I think he has performed admirably and credibly. So thank you very, very much. And I think you brought together very well some of the conversations that we've been having today, especially around ESGs and providing the business case why ESGs are important, because we started first with the standard setter, which is the IASB, who talked about creating the separate board that you referenced, as well as was referenced in other sessions. And then, of course, we are good accountants, we'll follow the standards because we want to have financial statements that have comparability and relevance, etc. But what else is in it for our organizations, and why do we then have to make that case to our CEOs and our boards as to why ESG and getting on board with them in terms of our organizations is important? And I think you gave us a good business case and a good way to start that conversation around how it will impact upon financial statements and help create value, not only just obviously affect valuations that we probably have to do on an annual basis, but just in general where we can find opportunities for growth and appreciation in our financial statements. So thank you for that. I don't actually have any questions in the Q&A, but that's okay. I think that the session stood on its own. And I do have someone who WhatsApp me to basically get them contacts for you. So know that your session was well received. So thank you very much.